And then we'll stop share and we'll get back into this. And then, so I want to introduce Amanda Lamont. She's going to be our thought leader and provocateur today. The title of what she's talking about is Nature-centered Resilience, seeing people as part of the system, not as the center of them. And Amanda comes to us with lots of experience, primarily from Australia, in emergency management and disaster resilience. And as a result of her experience, also heading up the Women in Emergencies network in Australia that responds to climate emergencies, she's been doing a lot of interesting thinking on how we think about resilience and how we think about recovery from emergencies. And she's here to kind of provoke and help us maybe think about this in different ways. So I'm going to hand it over to Amanda, and thank you for coming to share and provoke our thinking today.
Thank you so much, and hello everybody. I'm so happy to join you today, your first gathering for the year. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm standing on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my deepest respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge that this land was never ceded, and I'm truly honoured to be standing on this land, and I'm grateful for the deep connection that the Wurundjeri people have had to this land and their care for over 60,000 years. Yes, today as a provocation, I hope so. What I'm really looking for is your help, because I found myself in a pickle with my thinking and where to go to next. So this is a conversation today. I'm not doing a presentation. I want to share with you some of my thoughts and ideas and where I would like to go with the work that I'm doing here in Australia, and see what you think and get some feedback and reflections from you. So I started my career in emergency management in Australia after leaving the international humanitarian aid and community development sector. Quite a bit of time working in overseas contexts, and it was really interesting to see and learn about the disaster context in Australia. My first role was with the Australian Red Cross, and I was very much focused on working in recovery landscapes, and particularly around the people and social elements of disaster recovery. But I started developing a really strong knowledge of how our emergency management and disaster resilience frameworks worked in Australia. And after my work at the Red Cross, I got a role at local government. So in Australia, we have 3 tiers of government: national, state and local, which makes it incredibly complicated. And so I was understanding a more grassroots emergency response context around the organisations that work most closely to people. I say grassroots, but I'm really talking about people, because we have a very people and human-centric approach to disasters in Australia, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Then I got a role in the national conversation at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and I was a director there. And my role was really around knowledge broking. So my role was to bring together the best thinking from the different states and territories, and from the different sector groups, the research sector and education sector, community groups, NGOs, emergency services agencies, not-for-profits, the business and corporate sector, and to understand what are our best practice principles for managing emergencies in Australia. Now, the Institute was called Disaster Resilience because we were trying to shift the focus from emergency response to an overarching disaster resilient nation. So how do we build our disaster resilience? And this was obviously focused a lot on what the United Nations was doing with the disaster risk reduction department in the United Nations. So rather than wait for the thing to happen and then run around trying to fix it and make it okay, let's build our resilience through stronger focus on preparedness and thinking about recovery. You know, about probably 10 years ago now, the statistics were coming out from Deloitte's to say that for every dollar that we spend on preparedness, we're saving $7 on recovery. So there was a real momentum being gathered around the concept of disaster resilience. We had our first national disaster resilience strategy in 2011. So I was actually sitting around the table with the big thinkers and really loving it, because I got to absorb and understand what they were thinking and what they were doing, and then those organisations that got to apply it. So after about 10 years sitting around the table, but also having a very active role in emergencies, I'm a volunteer firefighter, and I have been for about 10 years, and I'm also still a volunteer with Australian Red Cross. And in both of those roles, I get deployed. Just a couple of months ago, I was deployed here in Victoria to respond to the massive flood events that we had all down the east coast of Australia. And you will have heard about the bushfires in 2019 and 20. So I was deployed both in my role as a firefighter in 2 different states, and also with the Red Cross spanning across 3 or 4 months. So I was advising governments in their work around relief and recovery. So I sort of tap into national strategy and then on the ground work as well. So after about 10 years, I started sitting in these national think tanks with the best thinkers. And what I found was we're all in furious agreement with each other, which I think is dangerous. And we weren't really getting to the implementation. And so I started feeling like I was in an echo chamber, and I needed to explore something new and different, because I was seeing disasters unfold with the same thing happening again and again, always focused on people. Looming in the background and starting to become a core of my work was climate change. And climate change we knew was going to have a significant impact on our disaster landscape, more frequent and severe disasters, cascading and compounding effects of different disasters happening at the same time or overlapping or one after the other. Very much, again, the focus was on people and the organisations that worked in that space. So we're going to run out of firefighters, we're going to run out of emergency service workers, and specifically volunteers. Communities would be really hammered. They were going to get tired. And of course, the money would run out. Government perspective, who supports people who have been impacted, and in responding, the money would run out. So we were trying to have a conversation about climate change and disasters, but struggling with our government. Well, that all shifted last year when we got a change of government, and now you will have seen internationally that Australia is coming with a stronger voice regarding climate action. Still a long way to go, but at least we're sitting at the table again. So in my frustration of getting bored about seeing the same thing happen and I didn't see us progress, I took up a role at Zoos Victoria. Now, Zoos Victoria is a conservation-based organisation. I was in the threatened species team. So I was brought in to support the organisation to be better prepared for those massive disaster events that impacted wildlife and habitat and biodiversity. So it was disasters that happened outside the zoo properties, and how do we actually set ourselves better up for success to respond to those disasters, but also to be better prepared. And slowly I started conversations around resilience and climate change, because there was just a focus on bushfires and response. And I said, we need to think bigger than this. We need to think about the impacts of climate on disasters and species extinction and biodiversity. And so it's shifted my thinking a lot, because what I realized was for 10 years, it was a very human-centric approach to how we thought about disasters. And the impact was much bigger than that. We were failing to consider and adequately prioritize the impact of climate change and disasters on natural spaces, species, habitats, biodiversity, environments, and that was going to be our real crisis if we didn't keep our eye on that. So I've now become a strong advocate in the disaster management and emergency management space, disaster resilience, climate action, for the voice of nature. Who's standing up for nature in these conversations, and how do we make sure that when we're preparing, responding and recovering from disasters, that nature is considered and not just as a byline. My feeling is it's still a byline, and our recent flooding events, I did run around the incident control rooms and the State Control Centre and ask who was looking after wildlife and the ecosystems, and no one was worried, because they are saying, well, what are you talking about? We've got lives to save here. So I'm the annoying voice in the corner that says, what about nature? What about ecosystems? What about biodiversity? What about the wildlife? So it's a hard and tricky conversation to have, because it's delicate, because it's seen as insensitive, inappropriate, and political suicide to not put people first all the time. So it's a challenging space, but I think there is room for a conversation. So I'm very focused on resilience. I'm all about building resilience, and I feel like in the last couple of years, people have been de-resilienced. And I don't know that's a word, but I feel like through COVID, through the constant impact of disasters, that people are getting worn out. Through COVID, people got used to being told what to do and how to manage and what to think and what to wear and how to do this, that I feel like people have lost the capacity to be thinking for themselves. And I feel like there's been a bit of a disconnect with nature and what's around them. So that's just a bit of an outline of the background. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to share some screenshots now to talk through that process again with some specific examples and provocations. So let me share my screen. Let's see how that goes. Okay, thumbs up, Kathy, if that's looking good for everybody. Fantastic. And it's good. It's getting lighter here. It was dark when I started the call, so hopefully I'm not in the dark too much now. So this is an underlying, I don't know, concept that I talk to a lot of people about, because it's about what we value. In building resilience and understanding disasters and impact and consequences, I think we really need to be starting about what do we value? Therefore, what is our objective when we are working in a disaster resilience and emergency management context? So I don't know who said this. If you look it up, a number of people have claimed this statement, but some people are so poor, all they have is money. And I think that that's worth thinking about as we have our chats and our conversations today. So think about that. Some people are so poor, all they have is money. So in conversations that I was having, I was talking to people sitting around the table in emergency management. I was sitting around the table talking to climate scientists, and at the time representing biodiversity and nature, being the voice for nature in the room. And what I realized was that there was a lack of consideration from the emergency management sector around what about biodiversity and what are we doing to save and protect biodiversity in disasters and emergencies. And the climate scientists working in the disaster landscape were still very much focused on people and things and infrastructure and economies. And when they were talking about the impacts of climate change on disasters and the flow-on consequences, the words they used were social impacts, health impacts on people, the economy, the infrastructure, buildings and bridges, and agriculture and livelihoods. And no one would talk about biodiversity and species and animals and ecosystems and the importance of those on everything else. What was interesting was that when I put my hand up and said, what about nature? What about ecosystems? Everyone really riffed off that and actually didn't get defensive. They actually said, yeah, that's important. We need to consider that. So there is a gap, but it's also, it's a door that's easy to push open because everybody is really interested in talking more about biodiversity and understanding how we can incorporate considerations of biodiversity and ecosystems and nature in our conversations around climate change and emergency management. So that's the gap there that I have found. I've tested my thinking with people and it's agreed that there is a gap and we need to be talking, bring those experts together in those three different sectors. I don't know whether you've seen this slide before, but I think this is where I got to in the last couple of years when I've shifted my focus from working with people in emergencies to considering biodiversity in emergencies. So there's the quote there from David Attenborough, what we do now and in the next few years will profoundly affect the next few thousand years. So we had a very short-term focus in our disaster management. Dare I say it was 3 years because that's our election cycle. So our disasters are really politicised in Australia and probably this happens elsewhere as well. That short-term thinking to get the votes is really overlooking this major crisis on our doorstep, which is biodiversity collapse. And so when I look at this slide, I say, well, you thought COVID was bad. this recession that we're talking about now. We were in 2020, 2021, 2022, and now we hear 2023 is going to be the financial crisis year. You thought that was bad. Well, actually, the impacts of climate change and global warming and a rise of temperature 1.5, 1.6, 2 degrees, that is going to fundamentally change the way we live and think and what we value and how we experience life. And if you thought that was bad, then the collapse of biodiversity and ecosystems around this is going to just overtake all of those things. And so this is what I'm talking about. Everybody thinks that that's important and that's important and that's important. And I'm saying, well, none of that's important if we had this huge tsunami of the collapse of biodiversity and ecosystems arrive. So I think this demonstrates exactly my point. I was mentioning before that working in disasters and climate change for so long, I tend to be the depressing person in the room. So I do want to say that I do think there is a lot to be hopeful about in our conversations. And I have been challenged and continue to talk about some of this stuff through the lens of hope, curiosity, and trust, because I think that's important. There is a lot to be hopeful about. If we were more curious, we might have more outcomes, and trust is really missing. And I think that's a key to moving forward. So here's another slide and a statement from the International Union for Conservation of Nature. You know, it's talking about investing nature and the importance of nature, the long-term benefits, but see what comes next. Long-term benefits for economic development and economic stability, communities and people and health and well-being. And then it's like, oh, as well as climate change and biodiversity conservation. So even the IUCN is still saying, you know, we need to look after nature because of us, not we need to look after nature for nature's sake. So these are great statements, but it's still a very human-centric approach. And this, I just grabbed this screenshot. I was looking around on the UNDRR site recently, you know, how we protect nature so nature can protect us. Now, I think it's really good that there is this focus around nature-based solutions because supporting nature is really important to our survival, but it's still very human-centric. We are seeing the protection of nature as important because we're important. We're in the center of that statement as well. So I still feel like it's not quite on, but I'm grateful to see the focus, but I still don't think that it's getting where I'd like it to be. And so this in disaster recovery in Australia, and it's actually the global platform as well, there are 4 pillars of recovery, and it's the built, economic, social and natural environments that we look to when we're looking at disaster recovery, and that extends through preparedness and response as well. But at the moment, even though the 4 pillars are sort of spoken about equally, the first one is always social or human. So humans are always at the center of our disaster narrative. And then we have consideration of the economic and built environments, O and nature. And I'm proposing, hey, imagine if we shifted that. Imagine if we put nature in the middle and then we considered the impacts on the built environment, the economy and people and social environments after we put nature first. And when I was thinking this, what would happen if we put nature in the middle? I'm reminded about how our traditional custodians here would laugh at that. That wouldn't make, these charts wouldn't make sense to them because they say, well, people are nature. People and nature are one and the same. So it's not an either nature or humans, it's all together. And so this profound change in our thinking to shift us from thinking about us as separate from nature to be us as inherently part of nature, you know, we the trees and we the land and we the sky and we the rain and we the wind and we the fish. So it's all of us together. So whilst we have this Western approach of separation, we are looking to combine that with traditional wisdom to say that we're all part of the same. And does that change how we can think about this? So can we apply an ancient wisdom lens to this resilience and nature versus human-centric conversation? I wanted to share this with you. This is a diagram from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they say risk sits there at the interface between vulnerability of people to disasters, exposure to disasters, and weather and climate events. So weather and climate events are going to impact our disaster risk. How vulnerable we are is going to impact the risk and the exposure to. So we've got mitigation on one side and adaptation and resilience on the other side. And when I look at this diagram, I say, well, that's pretty good. Actually, there's a fourth propeller on this diagram, which is response. So really interestingly now, they're saying that our response to disasters actually is going to impact our risk as well, which I think is a great to talk about. If we respond to disasters from a human-centric perspective, we might miss some cascading and flow-on consequences from a nature perspective. So our response might actually further have a negative impact on our risk landscape. So I think that's a pretty good diagram to describe really, really clearly how we understand disaster risk and therefore how we manage it. But I think what's missing is most disaster conversations start with what's the risk and how do we manage the risk? And I think we need to understand what we value first. How can we talk about risk until we've talked about what we value? Because this is where we get to there's no such thing as a natural disaster, hashtag no natural disaster. There is no such thing as a natural disaster. They're natural hazards. They're only disasters when they hurt things that we value. And so I think it's really important to first say, what do we value? Then what is the risk? And then what are we going to do about it? So I don't know whether you've heard about that. Look it up. There is a website, No Natural Disasters. If we talk about natural disasters, people say, well, it's natural. There's nothing I can do about it. So we just live in it. And it's stopping people taking action. Two, people are failing to understand it's only where people are positioned in the landscape that creates the disaster, or the disaster, the impact is on things that we care about, like cultural sites. So it's not necessarily, a shark in the water is not a disaster. It's only a disaster if you're in the water. Before that, it's just a hazard. So an earthquake in northwestern Australia where there are no traditional heritage and cultural sites and no people and no infrastructure, it's just an earthquake. But if it happens on the east coast, right in Sydney Harbour, that is a disaster because it's going to impact things. So I think it's really important the way we use words and how we talk about disaster. So what do we value? I think if we had a value conversation, we get to talk about nature, because people will then say, well, I really value plants and animals and clean air and clean water. So I would really like us to be having this conversation more in a disaster conversation. I just wanted to show you this slide. This is from Victoria, but it represents some of our emergency management priorities and principles in Australia. In Victoria, there are 6 priorities in an emergency response. Number 1, human life and relief of suffering. Number 2, community information warnings. Number 3 is protection of critical infrastructure and community assets. Number 4, residential property and places of primary residence. Number 5, protection of livelihoods, economic production and financial stability. And look at that, number 6, protection of environment and conservation assets. Now, it's 6th on the list, so it's last, but I say, but it's on the list, which means you can't ignore environment and conservation when we are responding to emergencies. So when I heard it was 6, I thought 6 isn't too bad. Then I heard there were only 6. So this sort of represents the framework in Australia, that nature comes last in our priorities. I would love to challenge you to say, are we ever going to shift that? You look at those 5 before. It would be really hard to say to the incident controller, don't worry about that house. There are some koalas and wallabies over there that need protection, or there is a swamp that's home to this indigenous fish that's been around for 60,000 years. We can't lose it. I say absolutely we have to have that conversation, and that's where I'm working now to get incident controllers to consider the fish in the river as well as the people in the homes appropriately and sensitively. Okay, so what would a nature-centric approach look like? This is just the start of my thinking, and this is an immature way of thinking because I want you to help me draw this out. So what would it look like? We would consider nature in the context of all of our actions and decisions and the event. What is the impact of what we are going to do, or this hazard, on nature? We would consider the long term, the really long term, intergenerational impacts of decisions that we make, and climate change and disasters now, not just human life or an election cycle. We would understand that because it's nature, we don't necessarily understand it. It's going to be uncertain, and there's going to be a lot of variability too. So to live in the discomfort and complexity of uncertainty and variability when we put nature in the middle. Future thinking. We still plan our disaster management on the basis of what's happened before. We lack the imagination to think to the future and plan for the future. We are rebuilding, build back better is the tagline for recovery, build back better. It's still backwards thinking, and it's talking about building. I think we need to learn from the back, but we need to really plan for the forward, and we're struggling with that. So a nature-centric approach, would be understanding tipping points in ecosystems and biodiversity, and that there's going to be deep fundamental transitional change in the way things work and interact when we put nature at the center, and how's that going to impact flow on for nature and for people. And also if we put nature in the middle, we would understand there are trade-offs here, people versus economy versus nature, but how can we actually balance the consideration so that we're not ignoring one totally over the other. So, what would nature do? And this is just something else, like a little thinker. What would nature do? So when we're managing disasters and managing climate change, what would nature do? How would nature respond? And this is when I've tapped in to some of the work that Kathy's doing is, what would nature do? How would nature manage? How would nature react? So what would nature do to support itself and be sustainable and effective and healthy and thriving in this disaster landscape? Can we learn from nature to better inform how we manage climate impacted and non-climate impacted disasters? So here's where we're going into, what are we going to talk about? Imagine if we transition to a climate-centric approach in emergency management and climate. Imagine if we did put nature in the middle. What would that mean? Imagine if nature was higher on those list of priorities when we looked at emergency response. Imagine if we thought about nature and we had a whole room in the State Control Centre full of people thinking about the impacts on nature and ecosystems and biodiversity. Imagine if we understood what we valued first, and then we asked ourselves what the risks were. Imagine if we looked more to Indigenous wisdom and knowledge for guidance in how we do this. What's been happening for 60,000 years, and how can we implement and work alongside Indigenous partners to learn from them and share what we've learned? Imagine if nature was not commoditized. I think this is a big problem. What can nature do for us? It's sort of seen as there for us. So imagine if nature was not seen as a commodity, but as part of us. And this is interesting. Imagine we had a nature wellbeing budget. And I won't go into this, but you probably will have heard of some countries have a wellbeing budget. New Zealand has one now. So they're basically saying, in all of our budgeting and costing and strategy and policy, let's think about the impacts of all of our political decisions on human wellbeing. Well, imagine if we had a nature wellbeing budget and we said, before we draft legislation, sign off on policy, finalise our budgets, we had to say the question all the time, what's the impact of this on nature? Wouldn't that be interesting? And finally, imagine if people were more connected to nature. And a lot of this, I think, would be innate. We would start thinking about this. So these are the discussions that I would like us to have. And there's some options here. I want to know, what is the good stuff that's already happening? That's my big thing. I'm sure I haven't said things to a lot of you that you haven't already been thinking. So if there are some really good examples of where we are having a nature-centric approach and it's working, I would like to hear about them. Or there might be discussions around, just from what I've said, what if, like, what's the question you've got? What if, or how to do this thing, or imagine if, or I wonder. And just to kick us off, and I'm going to stop now, to say one of the projects I worked on at Zoos Victoria was supporting people in their recovery from those horrific bushfires by connecting them to nature. And we are now having anecdotal evidence, and we're doing some evaluation to prove that by connecting people to nature in their disaster recovery, their recovery is enhanced and better. So if people see nature recovering, and if they see themselves as having a role in supporting nature's recovery, their recovery is better. And that's what I think is at the core of it, that if people were connected to nature and they started playing an active, knowledgeable, aware role in building nature's resilience, we are building human resilience. So yeah, nature needs us and we need nature, that beautiful feedback loop. We are one. So I'll leave it there and I'll hand it back to you, Kathy, and stop sharing.
I think I'm going to jump in here. Thank you so much, Amanda. This is going to be so interesting. I can't wait for these discussions. We are going to get you into small groups. Kathy's going to put us there so that we can talk about the good things that are happening and imagine what if. But before we do that, just an opportunity to ask any questions of Amanda before we hop over into our groups. Again, we're going to have a lot of good discussion in our groups, but this is, do we need any other questions answered, other things that we'd like to ask before we do that?
This might be an observation, but what you were talking about, it keeps reminding me of the 7th generation framework that is, I think, initially contributed to the Iroquois Confederation in the northern New York area, and this idea that that leaders need to think 7 generations in the future. But I also like to think of it as, what have we done in the past that has created the problems in the present? And what are we doing in our response in the present that's going to populate problems or possibilities for us in the future? And I think your whole presentation invites us an expanded time frame and timeline that is really critical. And this is not a habit that we do naturally in our overculture. So I think that what you have presented here gives us some hints about that some of the personal and community and societal transformations in thought that are going to need to occur for us to kind of confront and hopefully thrive through the disruptions that are coming our way and have come our way. So I really appreciate your thinking.
Well, and I just want to chime in that, those of you who may not have had a chance to follow along on the chat while Amanda was speaking, including you, Amanda, there's some wonderful kind of references to just some people's thinking that you're jarring along the way, as well as kind of reference to some different approaches or strategies kind of in that process. And I won't take the time now to recap, but some really interesting thoughts going at it here.
Would you be able to send those out with the follow-up? I'm on my phone and I'm not able to keep a copy of the comments. What's that?
Yeah, I think we could save the chat, Kathy, don't you think? And then we could maybe post it with the link.
Beautiful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we'll do that. Great. Any other questions for Amanda before we continue our conversations? I think we're ready to dive in, is what this sounds like. And so, Kathy, if you're ready to get us into groups, we'll get started.
Okay, here we go.
Ah,
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back. We have all of 4 minutes or so, but
Sorry
wow,
about that. I got lost in the conversation.
conversation in our group and just so wide ranging, beautiful. And I hope your groups were also very engaging and interesting and full of great ideas. We do have a couple of minutes. Would anybody like to share a pithy share of something they got in their breakout group or something that they shared that they want to share with the whole group? So if anybody wants to jump in, now is the time. We'll take a couple of responses, hopefully. Oh, okay. I see some chats here. Daniel, anybody want to share? How about, do you want me to call on somebody? Like Mark, do you want to share something from my group?
Sure. Well, we were talking about, we started talking about language and sort of the adjectives we use, and then talking about the verbs we use, about, and then how they tie to values. So when we nourish versus consume, when we replace something that's broken versus, leave it or throw it away, and how those actions that we do today when the value is focused on nature, it are the ways that we start where we are today and then build towards the future where more and more of us see nature as the center.
Yeah, so we talked about languaging. That also led us to talking about regenerative. So this idea of I even asked Mark, what do you think regenerative means to you personally? How do you live in a regenerative world or your own regenerative life or live in a regenerative culture? And it was another aspect of language of, as Daniel has said many times, is, we need to move beyond sustainability. Kathy too talks about a regenerative process. What does that mean from a languaging standpoint? How do we internalize that? And then that all ties back to values, what we value individually and value as a culture to change maybe the way the decisions that are made for the future. Does that spark anybody else want to share from another group? Got a minute, got a couple minutes. Let's hear at least from one more person. Who's feeling called? Don't be shy.
So,
Well,
go ahead.
I'll just say that I had asked in our group, Amanda, we got to be with Amanda, so that was fun. And I said, I loved her mantra of, through hope, curiosity, and trust, and asked if she had a word or two to share what gives her hope since she's in these circles before we sign off. It would be fun to.
Oh, cool. Yeah. That'll end perfectly with you, Amanda. What gives you hope?
okay, before I do that, I really just want to say something that Simon said, which will send us on another, something to go away and think about. But is there such a thing as a disaster in nature? That would be a really interesting thing to think about. And I love that. But in terms of what gives me hope, a million little pockets of magic give me hope. And I get quoted about my million pockets of magic all the time because we try and solve we try and have national disaster resilience. But I believe that is unachievable. But I know that there are millions of people and projects and communities that are already onto this and working on this and doing things. So we're not going to do this once for everyone all the time, everywhere. We're actually going to be doing this bit by bit. So what gives me hope is, despite what we read about in the media, because again, ruling people through fear and consumption is what somebody said one day. And if you want to know who, I can tell you later. But without media driving fear, actually people are just getting on with it with hope, right? So it's the million pockets of magic. It's the streets, it's the community groups, it's the individuals that are already doing this, already thinking about it without the hype, without needing to be on the front page. And some of those sort of pockets involve big corporates. So people are already just doing this without navel gazing. And it's that gives me hope that while we can sit here and think nothing's being done and we get told nothing's being done and people say, oh, nothing's being done, it's totally the opposite. There is a whole lot being done on this and that's giving me hope. And I want to just find them and hang around with them.
Very cool.
Thank you, Amanda. Awesome. And so that wraps us up for today. Quick reminder. So February 21st, that's our next call, correct, Kathy?
Yes, yep.
And remind us all now that everybody's here one more time, who's going to be speaking in February?
Ron Mills, who's been on our calls before and is doing great systems transformation work in communities, in Black communities in Toronto, and in working with Indigenous communities north of Toronto. So he's going to share some of his thinking and experience and wisdom.
Beautiful. Yeah, I hope you all can make it next month. And just a big thank you again to you, Amanda, for sharing your wisdom, your ideas, and sparking a conversation, hopeful conversation. So thank you again, Amanda. Thank you, everyone. We'll see
And if
you.
any of you want to be, a presenter or provocateur for any of our sessions going forward, just reach out. I know Simon has said that he would be willing, maybe in March or April. So I'm going to put him on the spot around that. But if others, just email me and let me know. And Sukaya, maybe we can circle back around with your well-being and resilience work that you've been doing. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Beautiful call. See you
All
later.
right.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Amanda, thank you so much for helping us out today. Really wonderful.
Yeah, it is like that, isn't it?
Yeah.
I
yeah.
was just doing some thinking yesterday around this, and I almost got to the point saying, oh, I don't even know how to talk about this, because you can get yourself so caught up in knots and in circles that it feels a bit hopeless. And I did get there a little bit yesterday until I talked to somebody, and I suddenly unraveled a little bit, like in a good way. I unraveled the knots. So I think the important thing is to keep talking about it.